Let's geek out on some gear, shall we? Today, guys, we're going to be doing Gear Through the Years, Kirk Hammett, part number 2. Let's get into it. So what's going on, everybody? Thank you so much for joining me for today's video, and yes, we are finally bringing back Gear Through the Years. Now, if you're just joining me in part 2, I already did part 1 from Kill 'Em All the way through And Justice for All, and now we're going to pick up from the Black Album all the way to current day, Hardwired to Self-Destruct. So let's dive on into it. Now, for all these albums and all these pieces of gear, I'm just focusing on the main ones that were used on the recording and the tour cycle. Kirk Hammett, especially from the later half of the Metallica career, the Metallica saga, he has certainly collected a huge variety of amps and guitars. So I'm going to focus on the main ones, because if I had to go through every single one that he once played, we'd be here all day. Alright, guys? So starting it off with the Black Album. So Kirk Hammett used a lot of different amps on the Black Album to create his tone. He used a Bradshaw preamp and a VHT power amp, and that was used for the lows. I saw that all over the internet because he was blending with another set of amps. He was using regular old Marshalls, so which I can assume are JCM 800s, for the highs, and then the lows and the highs were all going through Marshall cabinets loaded with vintage 30s. So what conclusion I can draw from this information is that, yes, the power amp preamp section was handling all the lower register of Kirk's overall sound, and then the high end was left more towards the Marshall sound and then just blended together. It's the best way I could describe what was going on there. The guitars used on the Black Album are as follows. He used a 1989 Gibson Les Paul Custom, the black one that he bought just after And Justice for All was recorded and finished. He also used the KH3 Eclipse, the one with the spider logo, and the MM290 with the Caution Hot tape on the actual guitar. And two minor pieces of information on the Black Album. The clean sound was a 1961 stock Stratocaster, and there was no TS9, no tube screamer in front of Kirk's sound, just raw amps. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Alright, so now we're about to enter the mid-90s, and now we're going to be talking about load and reload. Now this is the time period where Kirk's gear obsession really became out of control, and it's really difficult to track down every single piece of gear that Kirk used from the mid-90s all the way till present day. I mean, after the Black Album came out, they all became huge successes and, you know, multi-millionaires, so Kirk certainly spent a lot of his money on guitars. So I'm going to knock out the main ones that he had with ESP and other companies, alright? So the main guitars that Kirk was using for the Load and Reload album and tour cycles was a KH2 Ouija board and a KH2 Mummy. You guys have seen those guitars all over, some of Kirk's absolute favorites. Those are the main guitars used on those two albums. Another guitar he used was an ESP Wavecaster and a 1963 stock Seafoam Green Strat. And you can also hear Kirk talk about this Strat when he's doing another interview talking about his 1959 Gibson Les Paul. He's talking about the California fires and that the 63 Seafoam Green Strat was endangered, and he wanted to make sure he had that one safe as well. Pretty cool. Okay, so for the amps on load, he used a lot of Mesa Boogies. He used a Mesa Boogie Studio, a Triaxis, and then he also used a Vox AC30. And then for reload, he virtually used the same exact amplifiers, but he also used a matchless Spitfire. Alright, so this brings us to the infamous Saint Anger. Now, one of Metallica's least favorite albums in the fans' eyes, and yeah, not very commercially successful at all. But Kirk used a variety of gear on this album. Based on what I could find, Kirk Hammett on Saint Anger was using a variety of amps to include Mesa Boogies, Marshalls, Vox, and a 1959 Fender Twin Reverb. And it appears that the main guitar that was used for the recording of Saint Anger was a Gibson Les Paul. You can see it all over in some kind of monster. It's like a cherry burst, kind of traditional heritage burst with a really, really cool flame. And through that entire documentary, Kirk Hammett is jamming on that Les Paul quite extensively. Okay, now let's talk about Death Magnetic. Now, Death Magnetic, there's actually not a lot of information on the internet about this album. And if it wasn't for the documentary, that making of Death Magnetic, I'd have a tough time trying to find out what Kirk was using for those recording sessions. Throughout the majority of the runtime of that documentary, Kirk Hammett is jamming on his signature Mummy guitar from ESP, as well as a little red Fender Telecaster with single coils. I thought that was really interesting. The main amplifier used on Death Magnetic was Kirk's actual signature Randall head, the KH103, and he's been using that ever since. But during this time, this is when Kirk Hammett really started to get a whole bunch of new paint jobs with ESP to include Dracula, Bride of Frankenstein, etc. He had a lot of cool old school movie paint jobs on his guitars around this time, and they just started to come out of nowhere, and it's hard to keep up a little bit. He has quite the collection of old school horror movie guitars. And just before the recording of Hardwired to Self-Destruct, Kirk Hammett got his DC, his double cut, as well as his 1959 Gibson Les Paul. Alright, now this brings us to 2016's Hardwired to Self-Destruct. Now this is personally my favorite album in a long time from Metallica, and thanks to that documentary, you can see what Kirk Hammett was using for his gear. First off, right off the bat, he was using almost exclusively his Randall head. You can see it all over that documentary, the KH-103. That was the main rhythm sound that Kirk was using for that album. And as for guitars, he had more of the same. He had his Mummy guitar in the studio, he had his Nosferatu guitar in the studio, he had his 59 Les Paul in the studio. Basically, all of the guitars that we know Kirk Hammett to use and love, he was using on Hardwired to Self-Destruct. And again, you can check them all out on the making of that album. And 2 additional guitars that were used during the recording of Hardwired to Self-Destruct was the White Zombie guitar and the Green Burst guitar, 2 of Kirk Hammett's signature guitars from ESP. So guys, that's Kirk Hammett's gear through the years, part 2. How did you guys think I did? Now again, I just wanted to keep it very basic, very bare bones, because Kirk Hammett has a huge collection of guitars and amplifiers. So if I were to go in through every single one of his guitars, we'd be here all day. So I just wanted to focus on the main ones, guys, and I hope you dug the video. If there's one piece of information you thought I left out and it needs to be included in this video, leave it down below in the comments and we'll talk about it, alright guys? If you're brand new to my channel, thank you so much for watching to the end of this video. If you want to consider hitting that subscribe button, I'd really appreciate it. Guys, I'm out of here. Stay metal, and I'll see you guys next time. Later.